All right, hello and welcome everyone to the Mainline Rebalance Breakdown Part 2, and you may be wondering where Part 1 was, but that was the Devstream Breakdown where they went over much of the changes that we're going to be receiving literally tomorrow when I'm recording this video. If you are seeing this video on the day it comes out, I am live over at twitch.tv/Brozime, and I'm testing a lot of these changes as they are now out. So, I wanted to get this video out just to talk about what I think about the changes before then, but please feel free to come hang out on stream as I go through and test them all. Anyway, though, let us talk about these changes. Obviously, on the left here, I have the notes as they are on the site, and on the right, I have my notes on what I think is the most important things here. So let's get started. First and foremost, we have Warframe armor buffs. So this is buffs to a ton of different Warframe's armor. People have been noting that Banshee's going from 15 to 100, Banshee Prime getting a buff, Baruch getting buffs. All these different Warframes are getting increases to their armor amounts. But to me, what it really boils down to is two important increases in armor, which is Inaros, which is a minor thing, but Inaros is a very heavily used Warframe, so that is going to be important. He's going from 200 to 225 base armor. And we have Rhino, base Rhino, getting an increase in armor from 190 to 225, which is going to increase Rhino's survivability rather significantly because his armor directly affects his iron skin. So regular Rhino is going to be considerably better at getting a high amount of iron skin. If you're using an ironclad build, he's not going to be at any real gigantic disadvantage between Rhino and Rhino Prime. So there is that. Those are the two that I figured would be most important here. Obviously, we could spend all day looking at Trinity going from 15 to 125, but realistically, Trinity has 97.5% damage reduction at almost all times, so this armor bump is not really actually doing very much for her. Anyway, moving on, let's talk about some Arcane updates. So, first and foremost, we have Arcane Guardian. I talked about in the Devstream Breakdown, or the first part of the Mainline Rebalance discussion, that Arcane Guardian was very unfairly nerfed, and this is basically a platitude on that. So at rank 5 on damage, we're getting 15% chance for 900 armor now for 20 seconds. This is a little better. We're getting more armor now from Guardian, but we're still losing 5% of our chance, and we're not getting more time for it to go to rank 5. So overall, this is still an Arcane Guardian nerf because the chance is just going to be less consistent than it was, and this is going to provide considerably less of a boon to the Warframes that really wanted to use Guardian because they didn't really have much else that they wanted to slot in, and there will likely be a lot of people that will switch to Consequence, I think, because this seems to be where they're going to stick Guardian at. Anyway, though, we have a small clarification on Arcane Energize, and it will still give energy to toggled Warframe abilities. This has been asked a lot for good reason. This is incredibly important because this means that there are a ton of Warframes that do use Energize right now that will continue to use Energize, such as Mesa and just any Exalted Warframe is really what it boils down to. You've got an Excal, Ivara, all that business. They're all going to continue to be able to use Energize and benefit from it. We still don't have clarification on what that cooldown is going to be like on Energize, which is, of course, a big concern because if it is a long cooldown, it can just kill the Arcane outright. But I have hope that it won't be terribly crippling, considering we're going to need 21 Arcane Energizes in order to get this new level 5 Arcane Energize. Also, there's a clarification here that I did not make in my first video, which is that you do need 21 Arcanes to reach the new max rank of 5, but also keep in mind, Scarlet Spear, the next event coming up, will give us the opportunity to buy any Arcanes we want. We don't know how hard they're going to be to get in that event, but they are going to be offered as awards for that event. Then, let's talk about the Magus Arcane changes. For those of you that don't know what Magus Arcanes are, these are the ones that go on your operator, and there are very, very few of them of note, and that is just Elevate, Lockdown, and Repair. Those are basically the three useful ones. Elevate is going to be changed to give a 95% chance to restore 300 health to the Warframe, so you can only use one copy now, but it is very, very consistent and is going to restore a little bit more health. I think this is going to be extremely good and will definitely be a staple that I will probably never unequip. Elevate super solid, getting the access to healing whenever you may happen to need it is going to be super solid. That's going to be great, which is of course also what repair does, but we're going to get to that in a moment. Let's talk about lockdown. So for those of you that don't know what lockdown does, it drops a mine that tethers enemies in a range, and then it explodes, dealing their health as puncture damage. This part used to matter, doesn't really matter anymore. The tethering is the really strong part of this, and we're going to be able to tether more enemies in a larger range now. Of course, that is for getting 11 more of this Arcane, but that is not a terribly horrible thing to do because lockdown's pretty easily acquirable as long as you're leveled up in Fortuna. I will certainly be doing this, and I expect that Elevate Lockdown will be my loadout on my operator for most content in the game. These mines are really useful in a variety of different areas in the game because the tethering on 10 enemies also stuns those enemies. So you can tether enemies like the disruption enemies that are headed towards the points. You can slow them down and stop them. So it's much easier to kill them doing that. There's a lot of uses for this, like just in terms of being safe or just having a stun on command if you really happen to need it. And jumping out of your Warframe becomes a thing that is actually a positive in a number of situations if you have Magus Lockdown. So it's very nice to see this is buffed, so that's going to be fantastic. And then we have Magus Repair. This is going to heal Warframes within 30 meters by 25% health per second. A thing that I would have really liked to see on Magus Repair is if this healed allies within 30 meters for 25% health per second. And the reason for that is, and of course you'd probably give it some exceptions that it wouldn't be able to heal objectives necessarily, but I'd really love Magus Repair to be able to be a thing that heals as a kind of just function of our operator. Like, you wouldn't be able to heal like defense targets because they have a extremely large amount of health, and you wouldn't be able to heal probably like excavators because then you could probably just sit in transference next to them. But for game modes that are less popular, if they made this heal allies and healed companions and stuff as well, and like for the one where you're escorting, I'll flash it on screen. Don't remember the name of the mode because it's so not popular. Where you're rescuing the Grineer agents, if you had Magus Repair able to heal those dudes, that would be another option for doing that game mode. That would be less tedious than having to go equip Trinity or Oberon to do it. I think that's some stuff that could have happened to Magus Repair is just a buff to make it more relevant and kind of make it fight elevate a little harder, I think. But other than that, there are some changes to like Magus Vigor and the armor one as well. Neither of those are really going to matter in the regular course of gameplay, but for those of you that are hunting Eidolons, which you may want to because their Arcanes are changing and they're probably going to be at a value somewhere, those are also getting increases, so those are also kind of a thing. Moving on, though, let's talk about status changes. So I don't have specific notes for this because I think all of it is important, so we're going to go over kind of everything here. So basically, we have made substantial changes, not only adding stackable status effects to those status without it, but also changing some existing. This is really important because there are a lot of nerfs here. There are significant nerfs to like the current way Warframe is played, and we're going to talk about it. So first and foremost, we have Slash. Each Slash status has its own duration, but now we only show a maximum of 10 damage numbers in the HUD. Damage is unaffected, but reducing how many damage events we show helps with performance. Okay, so this is important. This is not changed. This is not going to be a nerf to Slash. Slash is staying the same. They're just changing how they show it in the HUD. That's totally fine. Next up, we have Impact. So this is repeat single target impact status effects will escalate the efficacy of impact status from stagger to full ragdoll. And this is no longer accurate. So this was this way earlier today, and everyone had the reaction of, I don't want to ragdoll my fucking enemies because it makes them way harder to kill. We would always much rather stun them in place like Impact does at current. So there will be no ragdoll on this. We don't know if there's going to be something in its place. There have been some good suggestions that I've seen, such as Impact would make it so enemies like kneel down for a Parazon finisher if you get enough of them in a row, or if they just like kneel down in general and have a very long stun happen. There's a lot of options here where Impact could still be good, but the ragdoll definitely would not have been good, so that's good to see. Puncture, unfortunately, the first puncture status effect has an enemy deal 30% less damage. Subsequent puncture status adds 5% weakening, leading up to 75% capped. Each puncture status has a duration of 6 seconds. Okay, this is not useful. Do you know why this is not useful? This does not deal more damage. That is why this is not useful. Like, let's think about how many puncture status you need to inflict for this to be a thing I ever give a fuck about. It's 30% on your first, and then you can get 5% up to 75%, right? So we have 45% that we can gain. That means that we need to inflict 8 total puncture procs to get 75% DR from one motherfucking enemy. That's dreadful. That's a horrible rate. Do you know what we usually do in Warframe to get this kind of similar effect? I put on Iron Skin. I play as a Naros. My Warframe is Nidus. Like, I'm playing as Grendel. There are a lot of options to survive in Warframe. There are a lot of tanks that also have some other side benefits that we play as a lot. The main goal of most Warframe builds is, hey, I should be able to survive and also do something else that's useful. Puncture is not going to be a thing. It's just not going to be useful. Like, it's nice that this is technically better, but technically better and useful are not the same. So, unfortunately, I think puncture is going to be the weakest of the IPS statuses, so that's unfortunate. Unfortunate for puncture-based weapons. Cold. First cold status effect deals 25% slow. Subsequent add 5% for a total of 70% slow at 10 procs. Each cold status has a duration of 6 seconds. Also, you guys will notice, not fucking useful. Because, like, again, this is to single enemies at a time in most cases. So you need to fucking proc cold 10 motherfucking times in order to just get a 70% slow for 10 motherfucking procs? If I proc an enemy with cold 4 times, they should be frozen motherfuck solid. If that's going to be any kind of useful ever, because it's just not efficient just to slow them like this. We get a better slow out of, like, basically anything else. Even Equinox slow, which is a suboptimal build in pretty much every situation I can think of, is much better than this. And, like, obviously that's using a Warframe, but again, like, instead of slowing them down, like, we could also just murder them. And the list goes on pretty far of Warframes that can just do that. Heat, not changing. This is not surprising. Heat is very good now, so it's good to see that it's not being nerfed in any way. Toxin, C/, so this is going to be the visual changes and performance increases, plus the base duration of Toxin status effect now matches Slash for 6 seconds. So the increased duration means that Toxin is going to do more damage now, so that's very nice, because it's just going to tick the damage it would before for longer. So that's actually very good. Toxin seeing a minor buff here, potentially to combat stronger Corpus shields. We'll see how that goes in the end, but Toxin is going to be a little bit more powerful. This is pretty reasonable. Toxin was already in a fairly solid spot, so that's good. Electric. AoE electric damage that is part of the status effect can now reoccur while the target is still under the stun animation of another electric status effect. In addition to this, that I really would have liked to see would be an increased range on how far this can occur and stun other enemies. But yeah, so there's that. Like, oh wait, no, this is, my bad, sorry, I read this wrong. This is the AoE electric damage that is a part of the status effect can now reoccur while the target is still under the stun animation of another electric status effect. I'm not sure how good this is going to be. I have never noticed electricity being very useful in terms of extra damage arcing or anything like that. And this would, essentially, if you could actually build around this and make it good, it would be like a chain lightning effect between enemies. But I don't see this being particularly effective. I can't believe I read that wrong the first time I read through it, though. Oh, well, that's electricity. Moving on, we have Blast. So this was AoE impact that goes through enhanced stages of crowd control and knockdown with repeat status. So this is not going to knock down anymore. Grants a Blast status effect to all enemies in a radius. Blast status reduces enemy accuracy by 30%. Subsequent adds 5% for a total of 75% at 10 stacks. Each Blast status has a 6-second duration. Okay. Once again, not useful. Like, just not. Like, it's not useful at all. Like, the thing about Blast is that it is an AoE that does this, so it's slightly better than Cold, I guess, but also decreasing the enemy accuracy, as we've seen with fucking Titania, who has this as a buff that she can put on herself to decrease enemy accuracy. It's just never good enough. You'd always rather have just raw damage reduction on yourself. And this Blast should just be a damaging thing. Like there should be an aspect to Blast that is just, hey, this does more fucking damage in one way or another. That's kind of what it needs. That's what the damage types are mostly for. Anyway, moving on, let's talk about Corrosive. The first Corrosive status effect strips 26% armor. Subsequent Corrosive status effect strips 6% more armor, leading up to 80% armor removal. Each Corrosive status effect lasts 8 seconds. So, there's a timer on Corrosive now, and it can no longer completely strip armor. That is problematic if armor is going to continue to be a problem in Warframe. The benefit here is that if you are using corrosive damage against the ferrite armor type, which is very common in Warframe, has a 75% damage bonus against it. And if you get to 80% armor removal, that 75% will ignore 75% of the remaining armor. So you will actually, using corrosive damage only be dealing with 5% of the enemy's armor, which is fairly effective, but still not 100%. So there's a slight upside to this because you're still going to be getting that additional bonus damage for not removing all of the enemy's armor. But not being able to remove all of the enemy's armor is really going to push us away from Corrosive, especially if this is going to have a timer on it because, you know, that's rough. Is this going to impact Saren in any major way? Actually, probably not. This will actually make Saren do more damage, which I know is kind of a weird thing to wrap your head around, but because Saren's 1 does corrosive damage, if she can't actually completely remove the enemy's armor with her corrosive procs, the actual damage that is being inflicted will be increased by 75% and ignore 75% of the armor. So she'll always be dealing with 5% of the armor, but be getting a full 75% damage bonus on those ticks of damage. So it will always work out that this is actually a change that buffs Saren, for anyone who was curious. And because the corrosive will be inflicted very constantly on her, this duration is not going to matter very much. Moving on, we have the first radiation status effect has an enemy deal 100% damage to allies. Subsequent radiation status adds plus 50% damage, leading up to 550% capped. Each radiation status effect has a duration of 12 seconds. So this is terrible. Having the enemy you inflict with radiation deal 100% more damage to allies, or even if it started at 550%, this doesn't fucking matter. We're just here to kill the enemies. Do you know what would be a really good thing for radiation to get? Is if you have a radiation status effect on an enemy and they're not targeting you for attacks, you deal 100% bonus damage to them. And then stack that up to, say, 200%. Probably wouldn't go to 550 in a scenario like that, but as long as they're not targeting you and they're under the effects of radiation, you deal more damage. That would be a very effective damage type. Unfortunately, this is still just going down the road of having enemies fight enemies, which just isn't effective in any way, shape, or form. Moving on to Magnetic. Magnetic was probably going to be super useful because it could just instantly wipe out shields essentially, but they've changed this completely. New status effect entirely. Enhanced damage. First magnetic status effect deals 100% additional shield damage. Subsequent magnetic status add 25% for a total of 325% capped. Enemies under a magnetic status effect cannot regenerate shields. Magnetic status duration is now 6 seconds. So if we ever have a problem with shields, them not being able to regenerate shields is an important part here. That is probably going to end up being a mechanic that DE uses in the future somewhere, where we will have to proc magnetic in order to stop an enemy from regenerating shields. I could see them kind of planning to do that. That may be a thing we need to do against the Corpus Liches, so probably prepare for that. Otherwise, there's no real reason to ever add this line of text. And the extra damage against shields is fine and all. If you're going to be going against heavily shielded enemies, it's much more likely that you'll just build for raw toxin instead of opting for magnetic, so you can just instead completely fucking ignore the shields. But yeah, if there's some reason that we need to stop enemies from regenerating shields for whatever happens, then that will be a thing. Also, Viral is being changed, not necessarily nerfed. This is a completely new status effect. Enhanced damage. The first Viral status effect deals 100% additional health damage. Subsequent Viral status adds 25% for a total of 325%. Note, before Viral would have a target's health pool and simply refresh the duration. Now it deals 2x damage to health and can scale up to 4.5x damage on repeat status effects. So, this needs a clarification. Viral damage, additional health damage. I think, personally, I am one who is of the mind that if an enemy has armor, I am still dealing health damage. But the way damage is dealt in Warframe, whenever you shoot an enemy, to check the damage types you're shooting them with, you're hitting an armored enemy, or you're hitting an unarmored enemy, or you're hitting a shield. That's the things that you can hit that modify your damage according to your damage type. If viral affects enemies who are armored, this is a buff. In general, it will be a buff on heavily statused weapons. If this is not going to affect enemies that are armored, this is a nerf. For sure. And I hope that it is a buff, because generally this makes a lot more sense than having the enemy's health, which could lead to some weird bugs here and there. You just doing more damage is generally going to be better anyway. So hopefully this works how I think it does, where you deal more damage to enemies who have armor, enemies who are without a shield, and enemies that are just health, as it were. So that's probably going to be very good. Gas, the base duration of a gas status effect now matches Slash for 6 seconds. This is a longer gas effect. This bodes really well for gas for 2 reasons. The first is that gas lasting longer means that it can do its thing for longer, which means considerably more damage because there's more time for enemies to pass through these areas. And secondly, gas turns into toxin procs, and gas is affected in the same way stealth gas was from the stealth modifier by faction damage mods. So with gas becoming stronger and potentially shields becoming more important and us needing to ignore shields, possibly, that makes Toxin significantly stronger, and if we can do a faction modifier through that, it's very likely that we're going to be able to abuse that to kill basically anything that exists. And if armor becomes considerably less of a problem, it's actually maybe pretty likely that we might end up with a gas build that uses a faction damage mod on a lot of different weapons to just chew through enemies. Obviously, those faction damage mods are incredibly expensive to level, but there's the potential that it will be worth it in the end. Moving on, let's talk about a thing that's going to be very controversial, I bet. There are 3 auras that target specific factions: Infested Impedance, Corrosive Projection, and Shield Disruption. You guys may remember Shield Disruption from its hits as running Eidolons extremely fast and skipping the shield phase that everyone hates, and Infested Impedance from its very old Nova farm, where you could make it so that all infested enemies could not move, so you could farm them at your whim. And you may remember Corrosive Projection from being the only aura worth equipping in the whole game, because it affects armor in the way that it does. We are rebalancing the faction auras to not completely bypass our rebalancing effort. More importantly, though, with the complete enemy defense rescale, these auras, mostly Corrosive Projection, because of course it's the useful one in current, will not be as necessary as they were. Why? We think being consistent is key. Passively removing 100% of an enemy's defense is not an interesting choice, and we were completely inconsistent in this regard with auras, i.e. the efficiency of 4x Corrosive Projections versus 4x Shield Disruptions. Expect these auras to reach somewhere in the 60 to 80% range when 4x are equipped, as we are still testing. Okay, so this is a problem because if they just give an enemy a fuck-zillion armor, we no longer will have a solution for that. So whenever, like, right now, what we've been doing with Corrosive Projection is essentially fucking fixing the balance of the game by removing the bullshit that they slapped on top of enemies. Corrosive Projection has been the thing that has been giving us the keys to the castle in that aspect. And I will almost certainly continue to use Corrosive Projection because it'll just be generally useful, and I've polarized every single one of my Warframes for it. So there's that. But I don't think that in general this is going to do much if they nerf Corrosive Projection enough, other than make it so people equip Steel Charge and just get more melee damage from their aura instead, and kind of emulate Corrosive Projection in that way and just skip out on all of these. Because Steel Charge not only is going to give you more points on your Warframe, but also melee is definitely the strongest weapon type right now, so I could see it being very valid that everyone will just go Steel Charge instead, especially if you've been spending Aura Forma to make it so you could make that switch very, very easily. But yeah, just getting more points for your Warframe, like being more easily able to fit in those other mods that you may otherwise not be able to fit with a lower count Aura, it's probably what this is going to end up making people do in general. Also, let's talk about self-damage and AoE weapons. So all these weapons listed here are going to be getting the blowback that the self-damage weapons are going to be changed to, and that's because these have explosive elements, as it were. For the vast majority of these, this is not really going to matter, but I'm going to mention the few that I think are going to matter in the grand scheme here. First and foremost is the static core. The static core is used at close range, fully charged pretty often, so this is going to be a significant nerf to how that weapon functions at current for the people that are currently using it, because you're usually at that close range, so you're going to have to be doing those recoveries pretty much every time you fire it if you're fully charging it. The pox also often used at closer ranges. This is going to make it hard to just rapid fire them into a group that you have zooped up as, say, Vauban or Nidus, if you're going to be standing close to it. That makes this a significantly worse weapon, so we will see how that goes, but in general, that is going to be a definite nerf. Also, just to mention it really quickly, I don't think this is going to affect the Tomb Finger very much, because the Tomb Finger's AoE is not that large, and the chances that it's going to be hitting you are pretty low. Even at like pretty much point blank range, you can just take one step back and pretty much be outside of it. So I don't think this is actually going to affect the Tomb Finger in a very negative way. Then we have the Grand Mu Prism and the Exard Scaffold. So this leads me to a big fucking question for DE. Why? These are operator weapons. Operator weapons do not need self-damage. They do not need blowback. They need buffs. Operator weapons are miserable to use in the content that they were built for, which is, of course, like the Eidolons. Using them there, you kill Eidolons very slowly, and the shield phases take forever unless you are doing the absolute most optimal comp possible. It makes them a slog, and it's unfortunate, because otherwise the Eidolon fights would be super, super fun. They're also how we access the Arcanes that they've been rebalancing. So adding this annoyance to the operator weapons is only going to make the people that didn't really like that fight super a lot dislike it more, and I think that's just a mistake, just out and out. Also, to go along with this, as a result of the overall systemic change, weapons with stagger will be getting approximately a 20% buff in damage with any weapon with AoE receiving a 50% radial damage fall off from central impact. This is no longer accurate after continued testing, so that thing that I said would be really fucking good is no longer happening. What we are doing now is no damage buffs have been added, but any weapons with AoE are receiving a 20% increase in radius. Okay, sure. Additionally, AoE weapons are receiving a 90% radial damage fall off from central impact. That means on the very outer section of the explosion radius, 10% of the damage will be dealt. Tactics will be deadly. Aim true, Tenno. So, the thing that they've done with explosive weapons is they made them single target. So instead of the explosion killing a bunch of enemies, it kills like one enemy and then slightly damages everyone else. That's what we wanted explosive weapons to do. I don't think that this will go over very well in most cases. At lower levels, sure, if you're using like the Brahma's 10% of that damage, it's still going to kill chump fuck enemies. But at higher levels, it's going to be extremely noticeable and extremely annoying that only one enemy dies when you shoot them with an explosive arrow, even though there were a bunch of dudes standing in the radius. So there's that. They do say here that like they want to buff this if it needs it after it comes out, so we'll see how it goes. But initially, like, if they had just decided to be like, okay, 20% buff and damage, we're not doing that anymore, we're just going to chill and then see if they need the 20% buff, I'd be like, okay, that sounds good. And then like the 50% radial damage fall off, that seems reasonable, because then at the edges of your radius, you're doing half your damage, and in most cases, that's fine, especially if you're aiming at the big tough enemy, then it's going to kill the weaker enemies around it in a lot of different scenarios where you're using a powerful explosive weapon. 10% of the damage doesn't work the same way, though. So, yeah, this is a handful of changes, all right. Some things good, some things questionable. I'm going to be very excited to go through and change a lot of my builds, I suppose, to test all of these different damage type changes just to see how they go. And, of course, like, test shotguns to see if they are nerfed into the void. Rank up a bunch of my Arcanes. I'll probably have to log on today, actually, just to make sure I can go and grab some more Arcanes that I need for my Operator. and such like that. But in general, these changes I think are overall positive. They want to head in a direction that I think is interesting, where like they're making it so more different damage types are important. But I think what they're more likely to do here is change the aura meta to steel charge, and make it so that corrosive isn't what we're using, because armor has been curbed slightly, and instead we're just going to use viral or gas depending on the way viral acts. And potentially viral heat will be the new thing, because viral and heat are slated to be pretty good, especially together. Anyway, that is going to do it for this Mainline Rebalance Breakdown Part 2. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know it's another long one, but yeah, I look forward to seeing you guys on stream. I'm going to be streaming today, like I said before. That's going to be over on twitch.tv/Brozime, and I will see y'all there, hopefully.